There is a term in criminology. It doesn't come from conspiracy forums. It comes from peer-reviewed academic research. Dr. Stephen Egger, a criminologist who spent decades studying serial killers, coined the phrase, "less dead." He wasn't being provocative. He was describing something he had documented with cold, hard data across dozens of cases. The term refers to victims who, in the eyes of law enforcement and the press, seem to matter less. Victims whose disappearances generate fewer resources, whose tip lines ring and ring without follow-up, whose families call and get told, wait. Egger identified a consistent pattern. Certain victims, people experiencing homelessness, people involved in sex work, people from low-income neighborhoods, people without social or political capital, were systematically under-prioritized in homicide investigations. Not because individual detectives were evil, not because every police department operated with deliberate malice, but because of something more insidious than that. Because of systemic bias embedded in the way investigations were resourced, prioritized, and tracked. And because that bias was invisible to the people enforcing it. This is not a theory. It is a documented pattern that shows up in case after case. The Green River Killer, the Long Island serial killer, the Gary, Indiana murders, the I-70 corridor cases. In each of these investigations, the same sequence played out. A killer operated, tips came in, the tips went nowhere, and the killer kept going, sometimes for a decade, sometimes for longer, until something changed. Until a victim appeared who didn't fit the original pattern, until a new detective pulled the old files, until a journalist or a family member refused to stop asking. I'm Danny Cruz. I spent years at the Miami Herald and the Tampa Bay Times covering institutional failures, healthcare fraud, wrongful convictions, cover-ups that bureaucracies tried to bury. And what I want to do today is walk you through how this actually works. Not the sensationalized version, not the TV version, the documented version, the version that sits in cold case files, academic journals, congressional testimony, and the words of the family members who spent years trying to be heard. Let's start with what the research actually says. In a 2004 study published in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, researchers analyzed unsolved homicide cases across multiple jurisdictions. They found that cases involving victims from lower socioeconomic backgrounds had, on average, fewer investigative hours logged, fewer lab resources allocated, fewer detective reassignments when initial leads went cold. The disparity wasn't small. It was statistically significant, reproducible, and consistent across cities that had never compared notes. That's what makes it structural. Structural problems don't require coordination. They just require the same flawed system operating in the same flawed way over and over, in place after place. Here's what that looks like on the ground. A woman goes missing from a neighborhood with high poverty and high crime. Her family calls the police. The police take a report. There's no press conference. There are no flyers distributed with departmental resources. The tip line, if one is even created, receives calls. Those calls are logged, but follow-up is slow. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. The family pushes. They're told the detective is working other cases. They're told there are no strong leads. They're told to wait. And while they wait, a killer who has done this before is still out there. And he knows, on some level, that where he operates determines how hard anyone will look for him. This is the environment that serial killers exploit. Not because they are criminal masterminds. Research consistently shows that most serial killers are opportunistic, not brilliant. They are organized enough to select victims who will generate fewer resources. Studies of convicted serial offenders show that many specifically targeted areas or populations where they calculated, consciously or not, that police response would be slower and less sustained. Robert Yates, convicted of killing 13 women in the Spokane area, targeted women involved in sex work. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, made statements after his arrest about why he selected his victims. He told investigators he chose women he believed police would not search for as hard. That is not a theory. That is a convicted killer's own testimony. The Green River case is one of the most documented examples of investigative disparity in American criminal history. Ridgway killed at least 49 women. The majority were women involved in street-level sex work. The investigation stretched from the early 1980s through Ridgway's arrest in 2001. For nearly 2 decades, tips came in. Ridgway himself was interviewed by investigators in 1983 and again in 1984. He passed a polygraph in 1984 and was not considered a strong suspect. The investigation continued, but the resources fluctuated. The families of the victims described a consistent experience, feeling dismissed, feeling like their daughters were treated as statistics rather than people. King County did significantly expand the investigation over time. Detectives like Dave Reichert devoted years to the case. I want to be precise here. This is not a story of lazy cops. It is a story of a system that allocated resources in ways that reflected broader social assumptions about whose death demanded urgency. When Ridgway was finally caught, it was through DNA evidence that had been collected years earlier. Technology caught him. The question that families still ask is what would have happened if that technology had been applied sooner, if more resources had gone in earlier. If you're watching this and you've never heard some of these stories before, stick with me, because in about 10 minutes we're going to get into what the case files actually showed about which tips were followed and which weren't. And it is going to make you understand why this pattern keeps repeating. If this is the kind of investigative content that matters to you, hit subscribe and the bell. That's how you don't miss what comes next. Now let's talk about Gary, Indiana, because Gary is a case that didn't get the national attention it deserved for years, and it illustrates the less dead dynamic with painful clarity. Between 1994 and 2008, a serial killer named Darren Vann claimed multiple victims in the Gary area. Vann, who was ultimately convicted in 2014 after his arrest in Hammond, Indiana, had a prior conviction for sexual assault in Texas. He had been released and relocated. He preyed on women, many of whom were experiencing homelessness or involved in sex work, in one of the most economically devastated cities in the United States. Gary had been hollowing out economically for decades. The steel industry collapse gutted the city. Poverty rates climbed. The tax base shrank. The police department was underfunded and overwhelmed. Clearance rates, the percentage of homicides that result in an arrest, were significantly below national averages. When bodies were found, the investigations often stalled quickly. Families reported feeling that there was no urgency. Local journalists who later investigated the cases found case files that were thin, follow-up notes that were sparse, connections between cases that should have been made earlier that weren't. Vann was arrested in 2014 after the murder of a woman in Hammond. Hammond had more resources than Gary. The investigation moved quickly. When Vann confessed, he led investigators to additional victims in Gary. Victims whose cases had been sitting open. Victims whose families had been waiting for years. The contrast between how the Hammond case moved and how the Gary cases had moved was visible in the case files. It was visible to the families. It was visible to the journalists who covered the aftermath. This is not me making an accusation against every individual detective who worked those cases. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision is how real problems get dismissed. The officers who were working in Gary were working in a systemically underfunded department in a systemically abandoned city. The failures were not primarily personal. They were structural. They were about resource allocation. They were about triage decisions that a depleted department had to make every day. But structural failures still have victims, and those victims were real people. Let's talk about what the case files, in multiple jurisdictions across multiple documented investigations, tend to show when researchers go back and analyze them. This is based on academic analyses, journalism investigations, and post-conviction reviews. The pattern is consistent. Tips from victims' families are logged, but rarely generate aggressive follow-up in the early stages. Tips that come in pointing to a specific individual in the community are processed, but without the corroboration resources, surveillance, forensic analysis, canvases, that the same tip might generate in a higher profile case. Connections between cases, similar victim profiles, similar geographic areas, similar MO, are not formally linked until the body count is significant enough to warrant a task force. The task force model is itself revealing. A serial killer task force is activated when the pattern is undeniable and the public pressure is significant enough. But by the time those conditions are met, the killer has usually been operating for years. The task force represents the department finally allocating the resources that could have been allocated earlier. In the Long Island serial killer case, a case that remains unsolved, investigators faced criticism for years over the slow response to the disappearances of women whose families had been reporting them missing. The Suffolk County Police Department was later found to have significant internal problems. A state police review documented communication failures, evidence handling issues, and investigative breakdowns. The families in that case, the families of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and others, spent years pushing. They gave interviews. They created their own tip lines. They hired private investigators with money they didn't have. They did the work that a well-resourced investigation should have been doing, and they did it while grieving. That is what the less dead dynamic looks like from the inside. It looks like a mother spending her own money on a private investigator because she doesn't believe the police are working as hard as they would if her daughter had come from a different zip code. Research backs up that perception. A 2019 analysis published in the academic journal Homicide Studies found that clearance rates for homicides with victims from lower income backgrounds were measurably lower than for homicides with victims from higher income backgrounds, controlling for other variables. The researchers were careful to note that multiple factors contribute to clearance rates: witness cooperation, evidence availability, department resources, but after controlling for those factors, socioeconomic status of the victim still had a statistically significant relationship with whether a case was cleared. There's another layer to this that's important to understand. It's not just about what police do, it's about what the press does. Research on media coverage of missing persons and homicide victims consistently shows that victims from lower income backgrounds and certain racial groups receive significantly less coverage. Less coverage means less public pressure. Less public pressure means less political pressure. Less political pressure means fewer resources allocated. The system is interconnected. When the press decides that a case is not newsworthy, it removes one of the key accountability mechanisms that pushes departments to keep working. This is why journalists and community organizations matter in these cases. In multiple documented investigations, it was not the police department that maintained pressure. It was local journalists filing records requests, advocates mapping connections between cases, family members organizing and going public. The Gary case, the Long Island case, the cases documented in Robert Kolker's book, Lost Girls. In each of these situations, the families and advocates were doing investigative work that the system should have been resourced to do. What happens when the system finally does respond? When a task force is formed, when resources are allocated, when a killer is caught, often reveals just how much time was lost. Investigators looking backward through old case files frequently find tips that were logged but never followed up, witnesses who were interviewed once and never recontacted, forensic evidence that was collected but never processed because the lab queue was too long. In the Green River case, the task force that eventually solved it found years of accumulated investigative material that had never been fully cross-referenced. The information to catch Ridgway earlier may have existed in those files. It was never assembled into a coherent picture until much later. This is not speculation. This is what the post-conviction reviews documented. And it raises a question that is genuinely difficult. Not, were the detectives bad people? That's the wrong question. The right question is, what systemic changes would prevent the same pattern from repeating? Because it keeps repeating. What reforms have actually been proposed? Some have been implemented in certain jurisdictions. Mandatory cold case review timelines. Requirements that unsolved homicides be formally reviewed every set number of years, rather than sitting indefinitely. Statewide databases that link cases across jurisdictions. One of the documented failures in serial killer cases is that killers who operate across county or state lines fall through the cracks between departments that don't share information. The FBI's National Crime Information Center and the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, were created in part to address this. But VICAP remains significantly underused. Participation is voluntary. Many departments don't submit cases. The database is only as useful as the data that goes into it. Some researchers and advocates have pushed for dedicated resources for cases involving victims from high-risk populations, people experiencing homelessness, people involved in sex work. Not special treatment, equal treatment. The argument is that because these cases historically receive fewer resources, allocating specific resources corrects a documented disparity. Seattle's efforts to create better communication channels between law enforcement and advocacy organizations working with people in sex work is one documented example. It didn't solve everything, but it acknowledged that the old model wasn't working. There's also the question of bias training, not in the vague, mandatory seminar sense, but in terms of actually examining how triage decisions get made inside an investigation. How does a department decide which tips to follow up on first? How does it decide which cases get extra lab resources? If those decision processes have implicit bias baked in, and research suggests they often do, then changing the outcomes requires examining the process, not just the individuals. I want to come back to something because I think it's the most important part of this story, and I want to be direct about it. The families of these victims, in Gary, in King County, in Long Island, in every documented case where a serial killer operated in low-income communities for years before being caught, those families were not passive. They were not quiet. They were not invisible. They were screaming. They were calling tip lines. They were showing up at precincts. They were talking to anyone who would listen. The failure was not that nobody knew something was wrong. The failure was that the people who knew were not believed, not resourced, not taken seriously. The community knew. The families knew. The advocates knew. What they didn't have was institutional power. And when you don't have institutional power, knowledge alone doesn't move a bureaucracy. That's the part of this that needs to sit with people. Because the narrative around these cases often becomes about the clever killer or the hardworking detective who finally cracked it. But the fuller story is about a community that was trying to get someone to listen for years, and what it cost them that nobody did. The documented cases show us something else too. When communities do have advocates with access, when there is a journalist willing to file records requests, when there is a nonprofit with legal resources, when there is a politician who decides to hold hearings, the system responds differently. Not always quickly enough, not always correctly, but differently. That's not an accident. That's the system working as designed, responding to power. So what do you do with that information? What does it mean practically? If you are someone who works in law enforcement and you're watching this, the research isn't an accusation against you personally. It's an invitation to examine the process, to ask where your department's triage decisions come from, to ask who reviews cold cases and on what timeline, to ask whether VICAP is being used and why or why not. If you are someone in a community that has felt dismissed by an investigation, the pattern you are experiencing is documented. You are not imagining it. You are not being paranoid. And the most effective thing that communities have done based on documented cases is to get organized, get on record, and get a journalist or an advocate with access to public records involved. Because the accountability mechanism that has actually moved the needle in these cases is not internal to the police department. It is third party. It is public records. It is press. It is community organizations that refuse to stop asking. If you are someone who covers true crime, who watches it, who reads it, who listens to podcasts about it, consider what you are consuming. The cases that get the most coverage are not the cases with the most victims. They are often the cases with the most dramatic details or the victims with the most social capital. The less dead dynamic doesn't just apply to police. It applies to media. It applies to the content ecosystem. Every time we choose what to cover and what not to, we are making a decision about whose death matters publicly. These cases, Gary, Indiana, the Green River years, the Long Island investigation, the dozens of other cases documented in academic literature that never got national coverage, they matter. The victims had names, they had families, they had people who loved them and who have spent years demanding accountability for them. Those families deserve to have their story told as part of the real history of how this country has handled serial violence in low-income communities. That history is documented. The criminology research is there. The post-conviction reviews are there. The journalism investigations are there. The testimony of the families is there. What it requires is someone willing to read it, to sit with it, and to take it seriously. Not for entertainment, for accountability. I'm Danny Cruz. I don't have a badge. I have documents. And the documents on this one are clear. 15 years, tip after tip, community after community, trying to get someone to listen. The system failed them. Understanding exactly how it failed them and what would have to change to prevent it from failing the next family is the only reason to keep telling this story. If you made it this far, you're the kind of person who actually wants to understand how this works, not just the surface, the structure. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you want to keep going deeper into the cases and the systems behind them. There's a lot more to cover.